Hey everybody, Brad Panovich here talking about the polar vortex. Yes, unfortunately, it's that time of the year. It seems like every year we get this cycle of articles and hype and all this stuff going on talking about the polar vortex. So let me talk a little bit today about it, what it is, what it isn't, and what it means for us. First of all, don't get caught up in the term polar vortex. It is a term that's been around actually since about the 1850s, first time it was talked about. A lot of research into it since about the 1950s when we started noticing something called sudden stratospheric warming events, which is warming above the polar vortex, which caused it to weaken. So it's not a made-up term. It's really an actual scientific thing. And if you're a forecaster like me and you've been into winter weather for as long as I have, we've talked about the polar vortex for a long time. It just got a little bit hyped up since about the early 2010s because someone picked it up, sounded like a cool term, and everybody uses it. So let's talk about what it is. Now, it's been around forever. It's around every single winter. It's not rare. It's not new. It's nothing out of the ordinary. In fact, it sits over the polar regions. There's actually one over the North Pole and the South Pole. Now, the one we're talking about is the Arctic polar vortex. It's mainly in the mid and upper levels of the atmosphere, and the polar vortex never ever really moves south. Now, there can be some arguments made, and I'll show you that pieces of it broke off and got close to the U.S., but what you need to think about with the polar vortex, it's more a driver of weather than an actual thing that arrives in the United States. Think of it like El Nino. El Nino is warming water in the Pacific. El Nino doesn't move into the U.S. El Nino causes certain weather patterns and certain climate shifts over the U.S. that you experience. So think of it that way. The polar vortex, what happens is kind of interesting. It sits over the polar regions up here and it spins and it's like a force field. So it kind of keeps the cold air bottled up. Now, when it weakens, and this is the thing about it, it's actually when it's at its weakest state that we see cold air, not when it's really strong and powerful. When it weakens, it allows cold air to spill south. And so the jet stream will dip and we'll get shots of cold air. But here's the thing. We don't always know where that cold air is going to go. When we see these warming events or the polar vortex weakening, there's about a 2-week lag where cold air spills somewhere into the southern part of the northern hemisphere. And what I mean by that is it goes from being over the North Pole into Canada, into Siberia, into Europe, into the US. And in 2014, there was a really good example of this where it weakened and a chunk of the polar vortex did come down into eastern Canada, never really made it to the US, but it allowed for cold air to drive deep into the southeast and the eastern US experienced really, really cold air. Now, the thing about the polar vortex, which makes it kind of fascinating, is as it kind of meanders up here, and I'll show you a loop, this is the GFS loop, that cold air eventually starts to drift south. So we'll back this up to this week, and you can see the cold air kind of bottled up over Canada. And what happens, it's kind of like an amoeba-shaped thing. It's not a perfect circle. These little lobes come south, some warm air goes north, and you end up getting cold air spilling south. So what happens is when that force field or the polar vortex breaks down a little bit or gets weaker, cold air moves to the south. The problem is we don't always know where that's going to go. And I got my soccer ball here today to kind of show you. I brought my son's soccer ball in here, and I'll pop this up full screen. If this is the globe, and cold air is on the top, if you spill water on this ball, you know water is going to run off in some direction. You don't know exactly where. It's kind of random. And that's kind of the case with the polar vortex. When we see this weakening, we know that cold air is going to come to the south. Now, I'm going to show you this model going out to Christmas Day, and I'll show you there's no sign of this polar vortex coming anywhere near the U.S. or driving cold air to the south. We're going to go towards Christmas morning here. And you can see there's a dip in the jet stream developing over Western Canada with a lot of cold air, but nothing over the southeast that would say cold or stormy. In fact, it looks pretty typical and pretty mild. But there is a sign that if we go long range, way out past Christmas, maybe towards New Year's, it does look like a significant dip in the jet stream develops over the western U.S. Now, we're talking 10 to 15 days out. This dip could be here, it could be here, it could be here. We don't really know that yet. So all we know is that there's signs that the polar vortex is going to weaken, which would cause cold air to spill south. And just like my soccer ball example, we don't always know where it's going to go. In fact, the thing to remember about the polar vortex, when it weakens and cold air goes south, typically warm air has to go north somewhere too, because what happens is cold air comes south, you get these huge, what we call amplifications, ridge trough set up in the jet stream. So if you've ever watched me talk about when we get cold air here in the southeast and in the Carolinas, Usually we get warm air into Canada, Western Canada and Alaska, and the dip in the jet stream develops over the eastern U.S., and there'll be a big ridge of high pressure in the Atlantic. That's how we get our mother loads of cold air. But the problem is that setup, a subtle shift east and west of the trough ridge setup, can have huge ramifications. Sometimes this jet stream can actually cause really warm air in the winter. When it buckles over us, we end up with a bunch of warm air here in the southeast. All this warm air shoots here and the cold air goes into the western U.S. And this will flip-flop, by the way, depending on the pattern. So the thing to remember here, what you're hearing about the polar vortex is totally taken out of context and really not the full picture. It's a real thing, and it drives cold air south. The problem is the polar vortex isn't moving over your house. The cold air could move south if we see the polar vortex weaken, but right now there's literally no signs of cold air heading into the Carolinas. In fact, I'm going to show you real quickly a look at this. This is the long range, same 500 millibar heights. You can see we're looking for big dips in the jet stream around the 30th of December, not much. You can actually see it looks like a piece of the polar vortex broke off over northern Canada, but it's not anywhere near the U.S. and specifically not anywhere near the Carolinas. But the signs of something coming into Canada certainly there. I just think it's a kind of question mark about where. And if you're wondering about Christmas Day, this is the forecast right now for Christmas Day from the GFS model. Right now, that's a big area of high pressure parked over the mid-Atlantic and the southeast. And really, this just screams sunny skies and maybe, I pull up a sound in here, maybe temperatures in the low 50s. So don't get caught up in the hype, I'm sorry, with these winter forecasts for around Christmas. It's just not happening. But the polar vortex is cool. That's the thing about weather and climate. This stuff is really fascinating and cool to talk about. I don't understand why people have to use basically hyped up terms and use it in different ways to get people to click on stuff. I think this stuff is amazing and it's fascinating in and of itself. It really doesn't need any superlatives or anything added to it to make it even cooler, because the polar vortex is a legit thing. And guess what? It eventually will drive cold air into the eastern U.S. sometime in January. But then again, it is January. So we kind of expect it to get cold at some point in the heart of the winter. So hope that clears it up a little bit. I know there's a lot of confusing stuff out there. Just remember, stick with sources that actually have scientists and meteorologists and people that know what they're talking about. Sometimes what happens in the media, especially in journalism, is interviews get done and it's like a game of telephone. So by the time this gets put into an article online or a Facebook post, it's like the fourth or fifth person it's gone through, and it gets watered down and the story completely changes. So just be cautious with what you read out there. I'm always going to be honest with you. I'm not going to hype this up. There's no need to. Like I said, it's cool in and of itself. And if you're wondering about a cold pattern, keep an eye on January. But like I said, the next 2 weeks looking pretty warm here in the southeast. Have a great Wednesday, everybody.